Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm exploring a railway-related theme with a guest whose work has inspired me and who has lots of insights for us into what happens when human decision-making goes wrong. The episode is inspired by the fact that over this past year, I've been spending a lot more time on the train than ever before. I'm in the process of moving between London and Munich, and I'm travelling a lot between the two cities. Since I'm self-employed and have some flexibility, I decided that I'd try to avoid flying and take the train instead. Now, when I'm travelling, for business or for leisure, if it's possible to do it by train, I'll take that option over flying. Not just for environmental reasons, but also because I've realised that the quality of the time spent travelling by train is far higher than by plane. All of which means I've learned far more about European cross-border train travel than I was ever expecting. It also meant that I looked for people on social media with even more experience than I had that I could learn from. Which is where my guest, Jon Worth, comes in. Jon is a railway activist, someone who believes passionately in encouraging people to travel by train where possible. And it's that phrase, where possible, that drives him. Because, as you'll hear, Jon has a particular interest in encouraging cross-border rail travel. Not just the kind of trips I do from major city to major city, but also people who want to do a short commute across a national border. He's on a mission to persuade European politicians to improve cross-border rail services. Why and how are things we'll explore. Even if you've never taken a cross-border train, what Jon has to say is fascinating. I wanted to speak to Jon because the subject matter he's lobbying for, I think, is really important, but also because of the way he's going about it. As we explore, his activism comes with a healthy dose of mischief. Having heard about the fact that a train service running from Belgium to France was being decommissioned, Jon organised a funeral service for the train, turned up to ride on the last ever service with a wreath and commemorative speech. It's a great example of the creative thinking that he deploys to deliver his message. Before we begin the episode, a quick reminder, my new book, Humanising Rules, Bringing Behavioural Science to Ethics and Compliance, is out this coming March, and you can get it on pre-order now. There are links for that in the show notes. There will be some exclusive content and events for anybody who pre-orders ahead of publication date, so when you do, please keep hold of your receipt. And now, on with the show. I know you are going to enjoy this. His enthusiasm for his subject is infectious. He's got some amazing insights. So please enjoy my discussion with Jon Worth on railway activism. Jon, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Hello. So we're going to talk about railways today.
We are, but before we talk about railways, can we talk about you and just tell my listeners a little bit about yourself?
Right. So I'm a self-employed British guy based in Berlin. Normally, my main job prior to getting involved in all this campaigning about railways was actually teaching people about the European Union, doing consultancy and training about European Union politics. I'm essentially a EU politics nerd by background. But out of political conviction, I try to avoid flying, and that means taking the train. And because I'm self-employed, quite mobile, I have clients a bit all over Europe. That means I travel a lot by train. And after many years of doing that, I started to get rather frustrated that things were breaking down and things were not as easy as they should have been, and started to ask myself the question, why is that? And so then from the end of 2019, I started to focus a lot more on my kind of energy and activism to try to address that point, and try to basically become a kind of an activist for the improvements of railways Europe-wide. But I come at this as a kind of from the passenger point of view. I don't work for a railway company or any kind of organization in the railway sector. But I came to the point of view that actually, well, no one was really making this case for what needed to be fixed in European railways. And if no one else was doing it, well, could I have a go? So 2 years into trying to have a go, here we are.
It's amazing. And I came across you because, saying to you before we started recording, so I'm in the process of trying to move from London to Munich. I'm shuttling between the two cities, and I sort of thought this is a bit ridiculous that I'm flying because there's no need for it. And actually the rail will be a much more pleasant thing. And I started to do it. And, you know, so when it works, it's brilliant. And then sometimes it doesn't. And I just started to look around, thought there must be people that are doing this much better with some insights. And so I came across Border Project. It just, both what you're doing, but the way you're going about it, eyes light up. And ever since, I've been a sort of passionate follower of yours. So I'm delighted to have you on the show. One, because I just think the you're dealing with is interesting, but two, the way you think about it and what you're trying to do, you're not some sort of rabid activist. You are very
Yeah.
clearly care about this, but you're going about it in a way that has a sort of glint in your eye.
Well,
There's a
exactly.
sense of
So
humor
the
as well.
cross-border rail project this year, it actually all started in a kind of a quiet moment in a COVID lockdown. I picked up an old report from the European Parliament from 2015, where a former MEP, Michel Kramer, he said, hey, here are 15 places in Europe where there used to be train connections and they don't exist any longer. The tracks fell into disrepair. And so 7 years on, I wanted to ask myself the question, well, did anything happen? Like, did anyone repair any of these 15 tracks that Kramer had put in this report? And the answer was only one had actually been repaired, 2 kilometers on the track, not so far from Munich, actually, in northern Bavaria, between Marktredwitz and an Asch in Czechia, had they reopened the line. It's like, hang on a minute, this is a bit poor, right? There are places where you could really improve Europe's railways and nothing is happening. So I set about saying, well, why is that? Now, what's really, really important to me is understanding these things on the ground. So out of this came a project, not to just basically intellectually study all of this, but actually really go and see it. Like, what does this really matter on the ground? Could you reactivate these lines? Could you reopen the tracks? Is there a possibility there? Is anyone even crossing those borders? And so out of that came this kind of quite slightly crazy project of crossing all of the internal borders of the European Union you can cross by train. So that ended up being 95 borders and 30,000 kilometers traveled by train, each and every day then documenting what's going on the ground. Now, much of our debate and discussion, in as far as there is one about railways Europe-wide, is mostly about high-speed connections between big Western European cities. Why is it not faster to get from Paris to Milan? Or how good is the connection between, I don't know, Berlin and Barcelona, right? Now, that's only part of it, right? There are lots of people who live at border regions in the European Union, like little places where actually they should be able to cross the border. They maybe live on one side of the border and they work on the other side of the border, or go to school or university or something on the other side of the border. And in all the other work I've done on EU politics over the years, the EU has done loads to help these border regions. They've opened up cross-border schools, cross-border music centres, cross-border hospitals. They've got, I don't know, the bin collections happen on the other side of the border, sewage systems for 2 villages that are separated by a border, all this stuff. But the train connections are, if not even not up to scratch, they're actually in some places going backwards. Now, I have, as a result of my work over all of these years, just simply, I've been to loads of these places already, simply because I needed to. But very, very many political decision makers have never been to these places. And these stories matter, right? When you're stuck somewhere. And so what I've basically been trying to do is collect up all of these stories from on the ground, say, actually, there are common things, common problems. The Latvian-Lithuanian border is similar to all the problems at the Polish-Slovakian border. And importantly, this is what the European Union ought to do about it. And so that's the kind of the crux of this, is giving what is a political problem a kind of storytelling joy about it, right? Now, and then some of these places, some of them are wonderful, some of them are a bit melancholy, some of them are extraordinary. And indeed, some of the most extraordinary ones, I've got no hope there'll ever be a railway line there again, but I'm very glad I went there. And out of that comes this sort of whole story of actually saying, what can we do on the ground, right? And so that's what drives me forward here. Or again, then this one that you alluded to in the introduction, I organised on 10th of December a funeral for a train because France and Belgium closed the cross-border line between Mons and Aulnoy in France. And so therefore it was a symbolic activity to say, well, actually, look, I want to highlight the nature of these problems, yeah? Because very much one of the things that really nags at me is our debate about railways is very, very national. There is a debate about the problems of Deutsche Bahn in Germany. There are all these questions in the UK about the problems of British Rail and the strikes and so on, right? But if something goes wrong internationally, there's not really the debate and the discussion about that, right? It kind of falls into a gap. So one of the trains which you no doubt will have taken to get from Munich to the UK, if you go via Brussels rather than via Paris, your normal route, right?
My
The
normal route,
Frankfurt to Brussels Intercity Express is German Railway's most unreliable Intercity Express train. Now, if Munich to Frankfurt were that bad, or Frankfurt to Berlin were that bad, that would be a scandal, right? And it would be in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung or the Süddeutsche Zeitung or whatever. Now, it's an international route, so it kind of falls into the trap For the Germans, it's that thing that runs to Belgium. For the Belgians, it's that thing that's run by the Germans. Yeah. And as if that were not all stupid enough already, right? Last month, German railways and Belgian railways and the transport ministers of the two countries held a party in Brussels celebrating 20 years of the ICE line to Brussels. Like, in August this year, 24% of the trains were cancelled, and of the trains that did run, only 49% of them were on time, right? The thing is a catastrophe, right? And so on one side, you've got the railway industry having a party celebrating 20 years of the line, and anyone who's ever taken it has got some bloody nightmarish story where they got stuck in a tunnel or it broke down, or the big brother voice in the train is going, Störung, 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 like cancel, like, it's breakdown, basically. And so what I'm trying to do is connect this up, right? Now, a lot of people come to me and say, hey, Jon, no one's going to take the train from Berlin to Lisbon, right? Now, probably no one is going to take the train from Berlin to Lisbon. That's not my concern, right? What I want is any trip which is viable by train, right? Something up to like 6 hours, maybe 8 hours at a push. All that should be doable by train, right? Berlin to Lisbon is still going to be 30 hours or something, however you look at it. No one's going to be doing that. That's right. I might do that as a kini once in a while. But I want all of these train trips, which should be possible, where trains should have a big market share. And at the moment, they don't. And that's the crux here. And is to then start to ask the question, why, right? And then to propose political changes to say, hey, what are we going to do about it? And what would be the ways and means of pushing for that change? And so that's what I'm trying to seek to address. Now, if I go that kind of extra mile, I go to these weird places at the far corners of Europe, and that makes a nice story that can highlight the everyday problems that everyone else is facing, then so be it.
Things, but what's really, I mean, you just, I mean, yeah, as I say, you're approaching it with a sense, a sort of like a wry smile, sense of humor, but it's like bothers you. And I agree with you. The more I hear you talking about these things,
Yep.
It's mad. It's utterly insane. And if we think about the idea that we want people to be able to travel cross border, well, why is that only by car?
Yep.
Or, why isn't it easy? But and then you talk, I've seen you talk about, for example, the tracks are there, but you're just not running a train.
Yep.
Or there's a train service, but nobody would ever use it because
Yep.
it runs at weird times and there isn't a regular enough service. So it's a point.
Yep.
On paper, there's a service. The reality is human beings wouldn't use it. Or you get dumped in one city, town maybe, and then the connecting train takes forever. And so there's all these little logistics that I think point together to something where if I go back, the thing that bothers me about it is you go back 100 years or whatever, and these things existed, right? You're in many cases, you're not asking.
They sort of did, right? But at least in the post-World War II period, right, we have this debate, in as far as there is one, right, that, go back to the 60s and 70s and everything worked better than it currently does, right? Now, I'm not sure, right? There's all this reminiscence in Germany about the return of the Trans-Europe Express from the 1970s. Like, that is the most elite international railway you could possibly imagine, right? It was incredibly expensive. It was first class only. It only ran very irregularly on certain routes. Now, if you managed to get a ticket for it, which you could get for no love, no money, right? It basically was priced by kilometer, so meaning the cost of getting from, I don't know, Amsterdam to Basel, it might have been super nice, but the vast majority of the population simply couldn't afford the thing, right? Now, so or if you look at the percentages of trips which are made on the railways in Germany and in France, right, they both slipped a bit, but the percentage that you did from France to Germany was always lower by train than it was within each of the individual countries. So this idea that certain things were somewhat better, but bear in mind, part of the reason why, for example, it's so difficult to get a ticket for an international trip is as a result of the impact of airlines on railway thinking, right? In the 80s, most railway tickets were just a cost per kilometer. We're doing 300 kilometers times the kilometer charge. That's the ticket price. Done, right? Now, airfares don't operate like that, right? Like, if I do an air route which is 500 kilometers compared to one that's 1,500 kilometers, my ticket is not going to become 3 times the price. Now, That's the reason then why railways introduced these cheap tickets which you can book off-peak or book ahead, called Sparpreis in Germany or an advanced saver in the UK, which got a lot more people onto the trains, but those are really difficult to combine. So if you've got a kind of a cheap saver ticket in France and a cheap saver ticket in Germany, how do you combine those two together? Now the answer has generally been you can't, and that has then also meant that those types of things that require the collaboration between different European railway companies then became rather difficult. But the motivation for making cheap off-peak saver tickets is in and of itself not the wrong one, right? Now, part of the difficulty then we come to the decision making in railways, is railways do not see short-term much of a business interest in the international component, right? Deutsche Bahn makes 95% of its money in Germany, right? SNCF makes 95% of its money in France. They really have got very, very little in the way of financial incentive about solving that international component. Now, that's why then you basically need political pressure to solve that international component. But ultimately, the amount of political pressure has not really been very high. Basically, the European Commission says, well, look, there's no legal barrier to stopping the railway companies solving that. I get to say to the European Commission, well, they're clearly not solving it. And the Commission says, well, sorry, the framework is there for them to solve it, but they're not really solving it. Yeah. And so you get kind of stuck in this sort of everyone kind of passes the ball round and round to each other, and you end up with the problem not being solved. But it's very, very important that we do not have today fewer international trains than we had 20 or 30 years ago. We have fewer stations served with direct international trains, right? So these crazy long services, there used to be a Madrid to Moscow night train carriage in the, if you can believe that, right? Including 3 changes of gauge of the wheels, right? Or 2 changes, 3 different gauges, in the 1990s. Now, like, you're never going to get that back, right? Like, that's a historical absurdity that thing even existed, right? Now, but you do have today more trains on Paris to Frankfurt than you had 10 years ago. You just don't have a Paris to Budapest anymore, right? Now, what you've got to make sure that you do, however, then, is you've got to make sure that if you're doing that, you do expect people to change trains, right? Your Paris-Budapest would be a Paris-Munich and a Munich-Budapest, or a Paris-Stuttgart and a Stuttgart-Budapest or something. But actually, to make sure that you can book a through ticket, that your passenger rights are guaranteed, right? I've got no fundamental problem with the elimination of the very long services, right? You do have to make sure, however, that whatever combination that people would need, that connections are guaranteed and timetables are organised, and there the European Union falls down, as I prove very much in the project. Again, I was going from rural Burgundy in France to Copenhagen the other week, which shouldn't be too difficult ultimately, but that required 8 changes of train to get from near Dijon to Copenhagen. Yeah, and that's only France to Germany to Denmark, right? There are only 3 countries involved there. That shouldn't be that complicated.
And one of the things I love, because you live tweet, right? So it's fascinating to sort of as you go, and it's very, you are an adept, right?
Yeah.
So you know where to look for the data, you know how to, you know where the routes are, you know where things are likely to go wrong. And so one of the things I love learning from you is like, you'll say, well, obviously this route's unreliable, and this is how I've managed to do it. And I'm like, oh, that's a clever trick. So I feel like I'm sort of learning from you as you go.
Right.
But the average passenger is quite painful. And yeah, the data and all these things exist. And so for me, it ought to be, in many cases, if we provided more information and easier for people, it could even with the lines that don't coexist, and we need new services and all those things. But even the services that do, there's much more capability to provide that sort of thing. But you do need a level of expertise to know how to navigate this stuff.
So basically, you've got to get a good international railway booking going. You basically got 3 components essentially. The first is the timetable, so when do the trains actually run? The second is then the ticket to book the thing. And the third is live running data, so if something has gone wrong, right? Now, we do not even have one proper European railway timetable, right? We used to have, now you're like, don't be stupid, John, we used to exist, but we don't really have it right now. There is the book, the former Thomas Cook European Railway Timetable, but nevertheless, that's only on paper, right? I'm very much someone who favors digital tools here. I should be able to have an app and give me all of the trains in Europe in an app and all of them that run. But that doesn't exist, right? There is a database exchange system between railways, which is called UIC Merit. But the problem is the quality of the data in it has been getting worse over the years. And so I, as an activist, approached the UIC, it's an organization based in Paris, and said, when conducting my research for my project this summer, I found all of these gaps in your data. Could you possibly tell me when you're going to put these trains in your database? No answer. I was then speaking at a conference, and it then turned out that one of the people from that organization was in the audience. And, dear Mr. Worth, you clearly do not understand the functioning of our database. It's like, okay, so here we go. These are all of the data gaps I found in your database. Could you just tell me whether I'm correct that this data is not in your database, right? The most absurd of all, of important tourist route, right? Try putting into any international timetable search Bordeaux in France to Bilbao in Spain, right? If you know the geography of France and Spain, that will route you along the Atlantic coast. And at the border, the Hendaye-Irun, there is a train, right, that crosses the border, but it's run by the Basque regional government, yeah? It appears nowhere, the timetables for it, other than on the website of that railway operator. Now, if you put that into an international timetable search like Deutsche Bahn, it sends you from Bordeaux to Barcelona, and then to Bilbao, right? It sends you via the Mediterranean coast, right? It's insane. Now, you should be able to fix that. Now, so I basically say to the organization in Paris responsible for the timetables, like, well, what are you doing, right? Here is like dozens of train services in Europe that are not in your database, right? And they say, well, sorry, Mr. Worth, you don't understand the system. And that's as far as you get, right? Now, these are public bodies, yeah? Like, I should not need specialist knowledge to know that that train exists in order to manage to be able to plan my trip, yeah? And so that's ultimately then why but the problem comes, yeah, is you don't make any money directly out of timetables, right? That's why these railway booking interfaces like Trainline or Omeo or Rail Europe, right? That's why we've not really got a kind of a sky scanner for rail, is because the second bit is missing, right? Because a sky scanner for rail equivalent, Trainline or something, can only sell you tickets at some routes. But the problem is if it's sending you on a route which doesn't make logical sense because you didn't have the timetable first for the train that was running, yeah, then you've got a problem. Now, what I'd really like to have would be basically a platform which also acknowledged the gaps in the system, right? The train line would say, hey, we'd really like to send you from Bordeaux to Bilbao via Hendaye-Irun. We can tell you there is a train, even though we can't sell you a ticket for it. Right? Now, that would be a genuine, step in the right direction, if you could have some kind of a service like that. But this type of thinking in the railway industry, yeah, who really cares about gaps in the European railway timetable, right? There's basically only one body that does. It's the European Union Agency for Railways in Valenciennes. I know them. Every time I come up with find something like this, I feed the information back to them and say, hey, I found another data hole, anything you can do to address it? And we have fixed one or two, yeah? But the railway companies themselves, right, have very, very little incentive to want to really change this. This is deeply, deeply frustrating.
And it's interesting the way you describe it. It's almost just like it's your fault.
Well, you feel...
Right, you're the idiot passengers who can't navigate this Kafkaesque system.
Why it often feels like railway companies don't want me to be there as a passenger, right? As if everything would basically would be fine and dandy, just if, we just got on with running the trains and we didn't have to deal with the pesky passengers. And certainly at Brussels European Union level, it definitely feels like that, because basically the railway companies like SNCF and Deutsche Bahn, they lobby very strongly. And the manufacturers lobby very strongly, so the people building the trains. But passengers are very, very weakly represented, or indeed actually big freight shippers are also quite weakly represented towards political decision makers. And so that's what I'm trying to do, is basically say, actually, look, with some pretty simple changes, this could be a lot better for us as railway passengers. Now, there are ways around some of those problems, right? And the digital communities, right, are people who will solve you any problem. Absolutely brilliant. They'll send you via stations which allow you to get around blockages. They'll find you crazy cheap tickets, which if you just split the ticket here or there, I helped a friend of mine who needed to get from Milan to Basel. I split his ticket this morning in Chiasso, the border station of Italy, to Switzerland, and saved him half the ticket price. Like, there's a solution for more or less any problem. But it just is deeply frustrating that how deep you've got to go and search for them, right, in order to manage to do what otherwise ought to be comparatively simple.
And that's the thing I found interesting is that you know, I'm not doing a particularly complex route, right? Ought to be very straightforward to go from London to Munich. And I've now worked out, having done it enough times, I kind of know where the kinks are and how to get around those and those sorts of things. But that's required me to have experience and the wherewithal to do it, and the time. And if I'm slightly delayed, it's not the end of the world, and I can factor my working life around it. I start to think about the average passenger who may not travel as frequently, who doesn't have the savvy, you know, maybe not tech savvy, maybe doesn't have the wherewithal. Comes a little bit of a nightmare.
Totally relate to that completely. And then, is my train on time, right? At least the data is exchanged correctly between German railways and Belgian railways. So you can see, is the train delayed on the other side of the border? But it isn't exchanged correctly between like French railways and German railways. So I'm traveling to France from Germany, like getting the information. I need another app at least to find out, is everything going to be smooth on the other side? But ultimately, what I've learned also from this project, talking to people in the railway industry, is I got talking to a guy from Thales, the tech provider of railway ticketing systems. Not to be confused, Thales, the railway operator. Anyway, Thales. They've got all the technical ability to do this if they are contracted by railway operators to provide those services, to exchange the data. I've had conversations with the railway manufacturer in Berlin, Stadler. It's a Swiss company, but they have a plant here in Berlin-Pankow. They have those systems in the trains for live running information to provide that information for passengers. But that's only as good as the data interface which is provided to them by the railways. So we can fix this if there is the will. But just the problem is in many cases there isn't the will. But it's very important that lots of European railways have gone really far away from what becomes a good railway, right? Now, let's just start back from that before we think about the international stuff. So, the railway in the EU that works best, right, probably is the Austrian one. Switzerland is good as well, but it's not in the EU, so it has slightly different legal frameworks. So let's focus on the Austrian one. They have a guideline in Austria that to make a railway line viable, it must have at least 10 trains a day running on it. Why is that? That basically gives you a train every 2 hours throughout the day from early morning to late evening. And the Austrians ultimately argue that that's about the minimum to mean that people can use the train for everyday trips, right? Imagine you live in a village, you work in the neighboring town, and your child still goes to school back in the village. And suddenly your kid falls ill and you need to get back home from work and go and pick up your kid, right? Now, you might wait an hour or two until you get home, but not more, right? If you're waiting 5 hours for the next train, forget it. You're not going to take the train, right? You'd buy a car, you might take a bus if there were one, right? So Austria basically says, look, if we can't find a financial arrangement to run 10 trains a day on a given route, we'd be better not running any and running a bus service, right? And in that regard, they are correct. Yeah. Now, if I am going to a business meeting, we were to have a business meeting, me from Berlin to you in Munich, right? My first train from here will be at 4 a.m. or 4:20 or something, right? I can get to Munich before my business meeting starts, and the last one home will be at 8, give or take, right? And even have a beer after the work meeting and still get home, yeah? Try that if you're doing a route like, for example, Frankfurt to Paris. The first train is too late, which means I can't get to a 9 a.m. meeting. The last train home is too early to mean I can't even have a glass of wine after my work meeting and still get back to Frankfurt. there's a gap of 4 hours in the middle of the day where there are no trains, meaning that basically if my plans suddenly change, that this next moment I suddenly need to get home, I can't. Yeah. It basically means if my life changes, the train can't handle the strain. Yeah. A good train with a good timetable can handle that of how my life changes, right? Or another one, I needed to get from rural Burgundy to Bruges in Belgium, right, in last month. Again, 5 and a bit hours trip time. There's no viable way of doing that by plane because there aren't any airports that would even fly me that route, yeah? But it was an absolute mess because what do the French do? They only think of point to point. They don't think of their railway as a network. So I take a 6 a.m. train to Paris that gets me to Paris at 8. But the problem is from Paris to Lille, I end up in a middle of the morning gap when the French are thinking, well, why would anyone want to go from Paris to Lille in the middle of the morning, right? Now, I am not going from Paris to Lille. I'm going from rural Burgundy to Bruges, and that happens to come in the middle of the morning, right? So you've got a big gap in the timetable. Now, also because they've invested in massive trains that they want to fill up completely. So they're not simply thinking, actually, hang on a minute, this train is really important for the kind of resilience of the system. They're just basically saying, how do we profit maximize this train? Oh shit, middle of the morning, that train is not profitable, cancel it, right? Now, because I'm determined enough, I found ways around that in order to manage to get my way to Bruges. But then eventually I'm ending up hanging around on more pieces of that route than I otherwise would have to because they've thinned out the timetable so much at off-peak times because they're thinking about the profit maximization of the individual train rather than thinking about rail's modal share in total. And so you then need to basically think about that in total for your entirety of your network, also internationally, yeah? If you want to bring regions together, you've got to make crossing a border by train just as simple and straightforward as an everyday occurrence as a train within one country. Like Norway, for example, it closed all of its international trains for 15 months during the COVID pandemic. The planes were going, the cars were going, the buses were going, and the trains were cancelled. That's not good enough. You've got to make sure that this is therefore systematically addressed. And so basically, take the timetable model, which is applied in Austria or in Czechia, and try and universalize that as much as possible. But that then also means for small places and non-densely populated areas, right? In the summer, I went to this tiny line in western Jutland at the border of Germany to Jutland. So from Nibel in the very northwestern corner of Germany, right next to Zurich, the island on the mainland there, to Tønne in southern Denmark. It's empty there. The villages are tiny. They have one small train, just 2 carriages, runs on diesel, but it runs once an hour all day through. That is as good as you can get. Like, that's perfect for that environment, right? It might not be a TGV. No Brussels politician might ever have taken it. But for those people in that region, given how few people live in that region, that's as good as you can get. Now, I'm cool with that, right? And so behind the scenes here is a kind of fundamental question, which is, how do you maximize railways' potential? How do you make the very, very best use of what you've got? And in tons of parts of Europe, we're miles away from making the best use of what we've got. We've got high-speed lines which are not running at capacity. We've got gaps in our timetable where you could put a train off-peak at low cost to get people out of cars or out of buses. We've got high-speed lines in Spain with 2 or 3 trains a day running on them, right? Have been funded by the European Union. Like, that's a scandal. So all across Europe, we've got also, particularly in France, got the old, the so-called classic network, the network which was built before the high-speed lines came along, which is chronically underused for both passenger and freight trains because France has focused very heavily on its high-speed trains. So there are an enormous amount of opportunities in all of this, if only political decision makers and railway industries could use it or see it. But very, very few of them can, unfortunately, and that's why I'm angry. Is that kind of seeing untapped opportunities.
And the bit I find really interesting is when you talk about it from the human perspective. Those points you make about, well, I'm not going to hang around for ages, or if it's a bit too difficult, I'm not going to do it, or I think there was a discussion you were involved with, which really opened my eyes about the sort of why do train services regularly
Yep.
cancel the last service of the day one's using it? Why is no one using it? Well, they're using they're going one service
Yep.
because the service is unreliable. And so the service before the last one is overcrowded,
Yeah.
and the last one tends to be empty because
Right.
that's the backup
Yeah.
option. But you need that in place. And so all of these things are looking at it's not the thing that amazes me is it's not difficult to sort of think, well, what would it be like if? And that seems to me is you're kind of just going through and saying, what's the
Yep.
what's the passenger experience? And then let's think about, and you've got this clash between the sort of economically driven
Yep.
central planning that looks at one world, and you're kind of shining a light on
Yep.
what's it like for the end user, and saying, well, it's not really surprising because the
Right.
two are not
But
always compatible.
if they are not compatible, then there are solutions available. But the problem is that railways fall into a kind of gap, right? So in as far as there's a European debate about railways, it's often focused on should it be public or private, right? And do we need more private operators or fewer as a solution to these problems? Now, my experience is there are both good and bad public railways and good and bad private ones. And you need a kind of horses for courses type of approach, right? So the high-speed trains in Italy are impeccably good. The high-speed trains in Italy are the best in Europe, in my experience. So Torino, Milano, Bologna, Firenze, Roma, Napoli, incredibly good high-speed corridor. Most of Italy's population lives along that route. The infrastructure is pretty much all good for 300 kilometers an hour, a bit of 250 in the middle, but it's pretty solid. And there are two operators, right? The state one, Trenitalia, and the private one, Italo. And they have slightly different service patterns. The onboard quality varies a little bit. Italo's a bit more intended for business people. If you were a family, I'd be more tempted to go for Trenitalia. But they're both really good. But you can run that line round the clock for a profit, like no problem at all. Demand is that big, like no problem at all. Now, there are other places, right? Like one of the absurd stories from my project was at the border of Latvia and Lithuania, where the train from Vilnius that used to run to Daugavpils, the second city of Latvia, with 80,000 people, now has been cut back to the last village in Lithuania, Turmantas, that has 286 inhabitants. Now, the people there, they need a train, and I saw people crossing the border on foot who could have better had a train rather than crossing that way to get to Lithuania. But you're never going to turn a profit out of the Daugavpils to Turmantas line, right? Trains in both Latvia and Lithuania are essentially mostly a transport means for the poorest part of society. Now, if the state, however, doesn't want to literally run the train, then you might be able to solve that one with some kind of competitive tendering. Right now, there are parts of Europe, particularly in Germany, where the regional trains are run based on competitive tendering. Bit mixed experience. In some parts of Germany, it's worked quite well, and in other parts of Germany, it's worked much less well. Now, you have to, before you get to that, you've got to work out what do we actually want in terms of service, right? You've got to basically say, we think that for the sake of this cross-border region, Daugavpils to Turmantas, there is enough cross-border demand here to need this number of trains per day, yeah? How much was it cost to run that number of trains per day? And when we've worked that out, then we come up with an operational plan. Now, it should work that way through, right? It shouldn't be, well, the state railway thinks that this line is unprofitable, therefore we'll cancel it. And surprise, surprise, no private rival can jump in because there's no private company that even is present on Lithuanian tracks, let alone being able to get hold of a suitable locomotive. And so therefore, you don't solve the problem that way, yeah? And so it all starts with the politics for all of these problems, right? You've got to want the train to run politically. And then you come to answer how, right? Now, and you've then got situations where there are certain lines which, to a superficial observer, look like they run quite well. But when you start looking at it, you see they're not even close to achieving their potential either. So if you take the route Amsterdam, Brussels, Paris, right, which is run by Thales, which is belongs 55% to the French SNCF, 20% to the Belgian SNCB, and 25% to private investors. But it's basically a 75% state-run company. Now, try booking a Thales train from Amsterdam to Paris a month out, and you're looking at like 140 or 170 euros single ticket. Like, the prices are sky high, right? Why are the prices sky high? Because all the trains are full. Thales has not added any capacity on that route in 20 years. And so they can basically say, well, whatever, providing our trains are full, we can price it at whatever the hell price we like, right? Now, how do you solve that, right? Now, so it's a state-owned company behaving like a rent-seeking capitalist. Yeah? Now, there are two options. You either say, hey, we, the governments that control the ownership of that company, we're going to oblige them to reduce their prices. That would be one option, but they're not doing that and haven't done it for 20 years. Or we, the state-run company, are going to buy new trains or run trains with a greater capacity. We make double-decker trains rather than the single-decker ones that run there at the moment. Or we do the Italian solution and we enforce competition. We basically make sure that someone else can run trains on that route, and we drive down the prices through competition. Now, the problem is you can't actually do competition on the line because you'd have to get a path into Paris Gare du Nord, and good luck trying to get that. What other company would try and rival SNCF on that route? Maybe the Italians could have a go, I don't know, right? But it would be damned hard to do so. So you've got a system which is neither a proper public service, nor is it a competitive market. And so therefore you have a situation where although the trains, when they do run, are nice, they are under capacity and chronically overpriced. And that therefore means that a load of people still fly from Amsterdam to Paris, and actually a load of budget users still take the bus, right? But what about an old train, right? You could even run a train on the old low-speed infrastructure in about 5.5 hours from Amsterdam to Paris, rather than the 3 hours a high-speed train takes, which would still be faster than a bus, right? Now, that can also work, but that also doesn't happen. And so on a route like that, you've got rail, which in terms of rail's modal share, rail is chronically underperforming. Now, here we then come to the mentality of like really bad decisions being made by railway, or from the passenger point of view, really bad decisions. Now, if you listen to one of the most bright and brilliant people in the entire railway industry that I've encountered, the boss of passenger transport of the Austrian railways, a chap called Kurt Bauer, he basically says, and when talking about Austria's night trains, he said, we realize we're not going to get rich out of running night trains, but our passengers really like them, and we see it as our aim or our purpose as a company to make sure that we provide what our customers want, and we're going to put on as many trains as we can without making a loss, right? That's what they're trying to do, right? Now, that's basically a modern ethos of a publicly owned railway company, yeah, right? They're not making a loss.
Right.
This is not like, I'm not expecting them to do bargain basement prices, right? They're basically saying, we're going to run as many trains as we can, right? Now, why does French SNCF not take that approach, right, to any of its international routes? Take Paris to Barcelona. It's got 2 trains a day, which is far too few. It takes 6.5 hours because they stop those trains too often. If you eliminated some of the stops, you could probably run it about 5:45 by my estimation, which would be a decent step forward. Now, it would be an ideal route for a night train. Why does SNCF not run a night train? Well, because they haven't got any. If they bought one, that would be an upfront investment. And if they bought one, some people would substitute from the daytime train to take the night train instead, right? So their profit would go down on the daytime train, despite the fact that rail's market share on the Paris-Barcelona route altogether would go up, right? So each train would be less profitable, but railways altogether would be doing better. Now, SNCF is a French publicly owned company. Now, if a publicly owned company can't take that ethos to go, actually, we're actually going to market share maximize, not profit maximize, then what the hell are we doing with publicly owned companies, right? It's a publicly owned company which is behaving like a profit-driven capitalist on the international component of what it does. Now, How do you unlock that one, right? You need to have someone else running it there, or the publicly owned company starts to better bloody behave like one. Yeah. And so that's the kind of crux of the problem that we end up coming up against in so many of these places.
And I mean, it's you've picked up and looking at this. I mean, clearly you know what you're talking about, and I mean, just your encyclopedia reports you've been to is one thing, but you've got to grips with this, and it's like, how do we get this information across? Because you're a passionate and you want to, and you get this. But what's your sort of strategy in terms of persuading people? I mean, is it just relentless bombarding with
at the moment?
stories?
That's what it's been. So I'm actually asking myself at the moment, what would be the best way of getting these messages to a bigger and different audience, right? So the project had its own following in social media. As a result of all of that, it drove a lot of mainstream media coverage, right? So the project's been covered by New York Times and Spiegel and Deutschlandfunk and Das Erste and so on, and plenty of media, particularly in Germany, but also a bit in France and in some other corners of Europe as well, right? It was like a minor star on Croatian TV when I was there, like the British blogger diagnosing the slowest train in Europe, which got cancelled incidentally, so I didn't even manage to take the slowest train in Europe. Anyway, now. So I'm asking myself the question now, what next, right? So one thing might be write a book about all of this, right? Write a kind of political polemic, how to fix Europe's railways or something like that. So something which actually explains the politics of all of this and basically says, actually, this is the ways and means of solving these problems. The second is build a kind of passenger campaigning organization towards the EU institutions in Brussels, basically do lobbying and basically say, hey, hang on a minute, like, look, these are the difficulties, these are the problems, these is practically in the legal framework what the European Union should fix. Now, someone needs to build that, but I don't know whether I'm quite the right person to be a sort of lobbyist on an everyday basis. I know some people who are, so maybe I could do that. The third option is build a railway company, right? That sounds slightly insane. Like, what the hell am I doing? A political blogger contemplating building a railway company. But there are international routes that I know would work, but to make basically to take the airline comparison, what you call a wet lease company would basically own carriages and provide staff to railway operators that needed a flexible product to allow them to run a route. So at the moment, if you wanted to start up for example, a container train that would ship containers from Munich to Amsterdam, you can get freight locomotives on the leasing market, you can get freight wagons, but you can't really get passenger carriages on the leasing market, and passenger locomotives you kind of can because there's some that can run both passengers and freight. But the difficulty is that if you're a small startup or even a small state railway, and like, I don't know, the Dutch want to run a night train from Amsterdam to Barcelona, even the Dutch state railways is not really big enough to buy a fleet of night train carriages for such a route. Now, could you make some kind of leasing operation that would be able to fill that gap? Right now, I'm having some conversations with some people about that. Or the fourth is maybe to run for political office and to try to get a place on the European Parliament election list for the German Green Party, where I'm a member of that party for the 2024 European elections. So basically say, well, look, I've seen all of this on the ground. This doesn't work politically in Brussels. Why not try, right? So those are the kind of things I'm thinking about, because I'm aware that I've kind of reached a bit the limit of what I can do with this individual project. And I've got to then take it some stage further. And I'm currently going through a kind of process of working out exactly what that would be. Like, writing a book would be fun, but I don't know how I finance it. Building a lobby association would be worthwhile, but I don't know if I'm the right character for that. I've never really built a company, but I see that there is a business opportunity there. Yeah, it's just a bit tricky. There are different ways and means that you can approach this problem, basically.
This gone? I mean, I recognise there will always be unpredictabilities, but is this gone in there? Has this gone faster, further? Like, what were you thinking when you started, or was there no thought? It was just literally, I need to do something, and we'll see where we end up.
It was partly motivated by having been stuck at home for 2 years during COVID and kind of like sort of vandalous, like, going to get out, right? it was also motivated by a little bit by the bicycle as well, right? So I acquired this 20-year-old folding bicycle, and I'd never had a folding bicycle before. I've always cycled in cities. And suddenly this bicycle, which I could take with me on train trips and allowed me to just see other things I could never otherwise investigate, that helped, right? So this kind of combination of different factors all kind of then all came together. What came out differently was the old report in the European Parliament was about railway infrastructure where there were railway lines that had fallen into disrepair, and whether you should rebuild them. Now, many of those railway lines are in really extraordinary places, like Canfranc at the French-Spanish border in the middle of the Pyrenees, or Breisach near Freiburg in southern Germany, where a bridge got blown up in World War II and never got reconstructed. Like, these are kind of, some of these have a very kind of historic kind of connotation to them.
Right.
Or Bad Radkersburg, Gornja Radgona at the Austrian-Slovenian border, where the town got divided in two at the end of World War I and ended up in two countries, right? Like, some of these places were brilliant, but the amount of traffic or rail opportunity in those places was basically non-existent, right? There were very, very hard things to fix. Now, so what I ultimately dug up was a bunch of situations where you're somewhere, you're like, this is so damned easy to fix. Why the hell has it not been fixed? And so ultimately the project came up with like even more absurd and even simpler things to fix than I imagined up at the beginning, right? Like database problems, timetable problems, tracks which were legally still active but had no trains running on them, problems thrown up by border controls, right? There are 4 cross-border lines between Slovenia and Croatia and 1 between Hungary and Croatia, which could quite easily be fixed now Croatia is joining Schengen at the beginning of next year, for example. So places where you got really, really quick wins, right? That to me was the slightly odd kind of an outcome. Yeah. And also there's the kind of the great humanity to this stuff, right? Like these places you go, these forgotten corners of Europe, right? There's this town in southern Sachsen, it's like south of Leipzig, called Seifhennersdorf, right? It's a town about 10,000 people that has a famous piano factory, and its railway station has not been served for more than 3 years. Because actually, you can only get to the rest of Germany through a sliver of Czech Republic, right? So it's in Germany, you go through a bit of Czechia, and then you go back into Germany, and then you get to Zittau, and from there you can go to Dresden and Leipzig and whatever. And you go to this place, and like, it's a matter of a couple of million euros to fix, right? There's a level crossing that's next to the railway station that somehow got broken, right? Like, it's an old technology, it was outdated, they couldn't repair it, and they said, well, we're just going to stop the train, right? Now, this place has a sort of melancholy sadness to it, like a cut-offness to it, yeah? And I see those places, like, they need that to work, damn it, yeah? Like, and that very, very basic, is politics capable of delivering for people in forgotten places? Yeah. And ultimately, it still makes me angry at a very human level that politics is failing the people of Seifhennersdorf. Yeah. It's failing the people of Calafat on the Romanian-Bulgarian border. It's failing the people of Ormenio on the Bulgarian-Greek border. Yeah, and those people haven't got the political lever to make that change. Yeah, and that sort of hollowness, like, nags at me, right? Part of the reason I've been involved in party politics since my teenage years is that I still believe in political solutions for these types of problems. right? That people should be able to get around. They should have reasonable healthcare, reasonable social security, and so on. That's why I'm politically active on the left, yeah? And there is a decoupling between how politicians talk about railways and what they actually do, yeah? You have the Belgian transport minister, Jean-Gilles Quinet, a politician of the Belgian Greens, talking about environmental sustainability in railways, at the same time as he's cancelling or letting the Mons to Aulnoy train line be cancelled, right? That should not happen, right? But how do I get to him? I can't get to him, right? Maybe a journalist can get to him, yeah? Now, there are some politicians who are better at this, right? The absolute best of the best is the transport minister in Austria, Leonore Gewessler, right? Who I met during my project. Which is a bit stupid, right? Because Austria's got the best cross-border railways going. Here I am as a railway campaigner, and I meet the minister in the country that's got the best, right? Well, okay, it was a nice meeting, and she's a friendly person, and we had a good chat. But and she understands, she works with the railway company, and at every single border of Austria, there is steady, concrete, decent, incremental positive change. Now, I can't get Georges Quinet. I can't get to the European Commissioner for Transport, Adina Valian. I can't get to Karima Deli, the chair of the Transport Committee in the European Parliament. Like, they talk the talk in Brussels EU decision-making about fixing the railways, but they're not actually walking the walk. And there's that gap, right? Now, when it comes to the European elections 2024, a bunch of politicians will go, we need to decarbonize, we need more trains, we need more freight on the railways. Well, what have they done, right? How much actual concrete, solid political decision-making will have been taken between 2019, the last European elections, and 2024, the next ones, to really concretely say, we are in a better spot now than we were in 2019? The answer is not much. Yeah? And that's that gap, that like implementation gap, is what annoys me and keeps on driving me on.
And I love just the way you talk about it. I love it because it's really infectious. And as I said at the beginning, it's you are clearly bothered by this and done what you did. Like if you weren't passionate about it, right? It involves effort and hassle and all those sorts of things. And you can say I go to some interesting places, but nonetheless, right? There's a time commitment and there's a pain in the arse factor and all those for very obvious reasons, right? Precisely because you're going to things that aren't working. So it's not just sort of you and you're making that commitment. And the bit I thought was intriguing when you talk in that passionate sense, you've still retained that ability not to get, because there's lots of activists that get really angry, right, and shouty. And I love the fact that, for example, one of the things you did was sent postcards on your trip to the EU commissioner, right? Which I just thought was bloody brilliant, right? Because it's not offensive, it's not sort of it's just
like
hello,
listen, please, right.
And so I wonder, what is it that allows you to do that? Or is that just
who I am?
Does it not even occur to you?
I'm not a very good person for hierarchies and structures. I'm a good person for creating broad participative networks. My online community among rail nerds is really, really good. Like tremendous people who help me with anything. Like brilliant people. And all at the kind of working level, like train drivers, signaling people who repair tracks, people who plan timetables, right? Like people who are the attendants in night trains, like brilliant people. And they've helped me enormously now, and I see it as my job of kind of bridging the gap between them and the political decision makers. And you can learn a hell of a lot from those people, right? Now, how do you then bottle that up and turn that into something that's then politically workable? Now, I've always found in politics, and that's probably also part of the reason why, although I'm an EU nerd, I'm very happy that I don't live in Brussels on an everyday basis, you can get kind of caught up in this sort of political bubble of political decision-making that's not connected down to real everyday people's concerns. And ultimately, that's what drove this project, or my motivation for this project at the beginning, right, was my own need, right? I wanted to avoid flying. I went on some really long train journeys and stuff just goes wrong. And so, like, it's the most kind of human need possible. And it's also rooted in what I've done a lot over the years, right? Like, I'm sort of formed in this kind of open source thinking, blogging, networking. Like, how do you build a network of people to solve any problem? I've built open source software tools, blogging platforms, work out who you can network together with to get a project going, crowdsource solutions to problems. If in doubt, write about it and see who else has got an interest, right? Like, that's very, very deep in how I've always behaved, right? I've done other weird and wonderful things in the past, right? Back in when I used to live in the UK still, you may have been in the UK when it happened, the so-called atheist bus campaign, that there's probably no God now, stop worrying and enjoy your life, that on the side of London buses, right? Right, so I was one of the two people that founded that. Right, now it wasn't my idea, it was a journalist whose idea it was. But basically it was like, look, like, I'm an atheist, I'm annoyed by there being Christian advertisements on the side of London buses. This comedian's got this idea of putting atheist adverts on the buses. Like, well, what can I do, right? Now, and that then came via, like, crowdfunding campaigns which came off my blog and so on. So I kind of sort of experimenting with open networks, right, as a way and means of solving political problems. Sometimes this stuff works, and sometimes it doesn't. But there'll be some other one which I can come up with. I actually got a one for the 1st of January coming up about cycling in Berlin, where they're changing the parking rules 1st of January in Berlin, and it's now allowed to, be able to park your bicycle for free on a car parking space. Now, I'm not going to park my regular bicycle because I'm pretty sure some car driver's going to come along, going to throw it on the pavement or something. So what I'm going to try and do is get a bunch of old bikes, right, for free that someone will lend me or give me or something, and park one whole car parking space outside my flat, just one, filled with bikes, and film what happens and see how long it is until someone slings all the bikes onto the pavement or I don't know, drives over them with a truck or something. But
I love that because I saw you were crowdsourcing for bikes, and it was like, doesn't matter if they work or not. And I was like, what is he up to?
I just want to do an experiment to, like, literally see, like, what happens. Like, I don't know. Anyway, like, and it's just, there is kind of experiments, like that type of thing about, like, I don't want to do it. Maybe nothing happens, but maybe if nothing happens, then that's also an interesting point. And so that's what drives a lot of these kind of things forward. And to me, the difficulty in Rail, right, if we then bring it back to the project, is how much understanding of the problems on the ground do the people taking decisions in railways really have? And my answer to that really is not very much, as far as I can tell, right? Just a small anecdote in that regard. Last year, I was on the European Union's publicity train, the so-called Connecting Europe Express, and I took it from Krakow in Poland to Ljubljana in Slovenia. And the train is rolling into Ljubljana station, and who is there on the platform but the European Commissioner for Transport, who'd flown to Ljubljana from Brussels? Yeah? What is this? Like, this is just plain wrong. Now, and also, even if a politician themselves does not take those services that they use, a good politician at least has advisors who understand, right? Like Franz Timmermans, the vice president of the European Commission, he's really angry about how hard railway booking is. Now, I don't know if that's simply whether he's had the problem, or his kids have had, or his staff have had, or what, but at least he's relatable, right? We've got many politicians taking decisions for us in this area that cannot begin to relate to the problems that railway passengers face, right? Not in the slightest. But politicians are not feeling it at the ballot box if this stuff is broken. Yeah. Like, if it doesn't work, how many voters are going to change their behavior at the next election on the basis of good or bad railways? Not many.
But I wonder whether, in a world of they're all the same, and this is a slightly more UK skewed thing where there's a cynicism across the piece, but I think that's a broader bit. I wonder whether actually, if you sort of sit there and go, my vote doesn't make any difference type thing. I wonder whether this isn't one of those things where it might shift the bat. You know, are you fed up with the fact this is crap? And you sort of go, well, here's somebody who's got a plan, because often politicians' plans for other things, the economy, and or immigration or whatever the big topic. There's always sort of fancy words, but people are quite cynical. It can be delivered. I think what's interesting about what you've talked about is that actually this is something that impacts people on a day-to-day basis. And if you have had a crappy experience on the railway or a really good one, right, it's something you can recognize. And so as you were talking, it sort of occurred to me, it might be actually, ironically, you're right to say it's not the headline thing, but actually maybe, well, why not vote for someone that is going to fix at least one thing?
So last weekend, I was at the European Green Party's Congress in Copenhagen. How many minutes in 3 days of the Congress were devoted to transport policy by the European Greens? 0. None. Right?
Wow.
Now, that is a Green Party that's supposed to believe in public transport, is supposed to want to adequately deal with the challenges of climate change. But it is the same party family that, for example, when the German Green Party was negotiating its coalition deal with the Liberals and the Social Democrats, it reportedly wanted the transport portfolio, but gave it up in the negotiations. And that's why Germany's now got a liberal transport. So I'm not even certain that green political movements are taking the climate change challenge and railways as a solution for decarbonising transport adequately seriously. And railway companies are definitely not taking it adequately seriously, right? Railways go, of course, we're the greenest transport mode, and they are, but are they actually capable of stepping up their services enough in order to manage to attract enough people from planes or buses or cars? No. So they can sit there quite contentedly going, oh, yeah, look, we're the greenest transport mode. There is no ambition in this sector, other than a bit in Austria and together with the Swiss, at least for long distance stuff. At a few borders here and there, there's a little bit going on at the northern Sweden, northern Finland border at Tornio-Haparanda. There's some bits and pieces there. There are some places where it works quite well, like everything around Basel or everything around Geneva. But like close to where you live, for example, like I didn't actually go there in my project. I only discovered this one at some point later. The München, Mühldorf, Simbach in Linz line, right? Now, that would shave half an hour off a Munich-Vienna trip if you ran the trains to Austria that way rather than via Salzburg. The track is single track diesel. The signalling on the line and the signal box dates from 1906. Germany has had a plan for more than 30 years to double track and electrify the line, right? Now, fixing that should be a no-brainer. There's even chemical industries around Mühldorf, right, which are supplied by goods trains on that line as well. So for freight as well as passengers, it would make sense. It would speed up the international route. It would make everything easier for commuters in Mühldorf and in Simbach. It'd be good for freight. It'd be good for the environment. You need to double-track the line and put up some overhead electric wiring on 140 kilometers, yeah? And Germany's been dithering for 30 years. Right? Like, that is... You can't explain that, right? Like, you have a... Yeah, we'll agree, we'll do so. Oh, no, sorry, the government changed. Oh, the local government's not in favour. And on and on and on and on it goes. Yeah. But then again, look at the quality of the politicians that Germany has had doing its railway policy over this period, right? Like 12 years of CSU politicians doing it. And now a pro-car dude from the FDP because the Greens gave up that in the negotiation in the coalition. You get, ultimately, bad quality political outcomes if you've got bad quality politicians taking the decision.
Wow. John, I could keep talking. I just love listening to what you have to say, but time against us. It's a positive note. Give us your, what really, like if people want to do amazing rail routes in
there are
Europe,
loads
what
of
would you
great
recommend?
ones. The most fun I had this summer was actually a rail route which was a bit frustrating to book. It was actually Zaragoza in northern Spain to Vigo in northwestern Spain, not going via Madrid. So the line goes right across northern Spain. It was wonderful. Not super fast, but changing landscapes, storks nesting, hills, vineyards, arable land. Wonderful, wonderful trip. That was really, really nice. So that was a new discovery. One of my favorites in Europe is in Norway. Goes from Bergen to Oslo. A wonderful mountainous route, also along the edge of a fjord, leaving from Bergen. So that's good. Closer to home for both of us, I very much like the old line along the Rhine in Germany. Yeah, so if you take the
That's lovely.
Cologne,
That one I've done.
Mainz, Frankfurt route, that's really stunning. So I like that one very much. Also, loads of tremendous routes in Czechia, and indeed a generally great railway. Not super fast always, but some really, really scenic lines there. So I very much also like the Berlin to Prague route, particularly with the dining car as it runs along the Elbe south of Dresden. So Dresden to Prague. So that's another good one as well. So loads of different interesting and scenic routes. And if you want the nicest night trains in Europe, this is a hidden gem. They're in Finland. So the best overnight services. So from Finnish Lapland to Helsinki, the most luxurious and brilliant night trains I've ever taken. So that was another discovery from this year's project.
I mean, I say this to all my guests, but genuinely thank you for what you do, right? Because it's energizing. It's pointing out stupidity and idiocy that need not exist. And I think you're genuinely like, I think you will get somewhere and you are making a difference. And I want to say, as somebody that regularly travels, I'm thrilled that you're there. I love the sense of humor and if you ever do, I'm, if my diary will permit, I will join you for your next crazy adventure. I wanted to be there for the funeral service on the train. So the next one of those, I will try and join you on it.
We'll come and we'll take the München-Mühldorf line and go to Austria.
Brilliant. Okay, well that's a rail date. Perfect stuff.
Yeah.
And I'll put
no problem.
I will put links to all of your social media and other things that I think are of interest to people in the show notes. But Jon, thank you so much for everything. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show.
So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk podcast. My enormous thanks to Jon for appearing and to you for listening. To find out more about Jon, his cross-border rail project and his other work, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. There's also a link to an article that Jon specifically wrote about the discussion we had on this show. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you liked this episode, then do also check out my discussion with Pete Dyson. He's the co-author of a wonderful book called Transport for Humans, which explores how we can make transport networks work better for people. I think you'll find it extremely insightful and highly relevant to the conversation I had with Jon. Finally, a reminder that my new book, Humanizing Rules, Bringing Behavioral Science to Ethics and Compliance, is out this coming March, and you can get it on pre-order now. There are links to that in the show notes. There'll be some exclusive content and events for anyone who pre-orders ahead of publication date, so do keep hold of your receipt. If you're listening to this shortly after release in December 2022, I'll be back between Christmas and New Year with another episode of this show. In the meantime, let me wish you all happy holidays, stay safe, and thank you so much for listening to this and all the previous episodes of the show. If you've missed any, visit humanriskpodcast.com. I'll see you back here very soon for another episode. Thanks for listening.